Hey guys, in this video, we will be looking at the folder structure of our newly created ASP.NET Core 3.1 web application. Now, our tool of choice is Visual Studio Community Edition 2019. And in the Solution Explorer that they afford us, we can see all of the files that are in our project. So we'll start with what's at the top. So you can see that it's kind of like a tree view or a hierarchy view of all of the files. Everything is a subfile of something else. So I'll start at the very top. So this is a solution file. So if you're not so familiar with Visual Studio and projects in Visual Studio, what they do is they create what you call a solution file, which is like an overall directory for all projects that might be inside of a solution. So you can have one solution and it has a web project, it has a C# class library. You can have a desktop project. You can have multiple projects within one solution. So in this situation, we have one solution. It's called Leave Management, and we have one project. So the solution is at the topmost, and then the project would be second in that list, and that is our web project. And if you click it, it kind of shows you that it's really just an XML file that is highlighting, certain properties that the project or solution will have to keep track of what is being done. So the solution is at the top, and it usually has that square with that infinity logo that Visual Studio has. And then we have the web project after that, and the web project, the icons kind of clue you in as to what kind of project it is. So this is our web project, and it is another directory for all of the files that will be used or created inside of the web project. So this web project represents our entire website that we're about to develop. Now, just walking through, we have connected services, and if you right click that, you can see you can add connected services. Connected services include like Microsoft Azure services, maybe DevOps services, anything that maybe can be connected to the project and used like a web service or an additional service. You can use that as a hub. For this video, I won't get into that. I just want you to understand what you're looking at. And then we have dependencies. So if you expand the dependencies, then you're seeing analyzers. So .NET Core comes with a few analyzers that help us with our debugging and our performance analysis as we go along. We have frameworks, so we know we're using the .NET Core app framework, and these two are .NET Core framework references. And then packages, where we actually know what kind of packages we're using. And a package can be like a third-party library that is a utility. So for instance, Bootstrap, well, at least in previous versions, you could download Bootstrap. Not that you can't, no, sorry, but it's not implemented that way primarily. But the point is, if you have a third-party library that you want to include in your project, then you would download what we call a package using a tool called NuGet. So if you right-click dependencies, then you'll see something called Manage NuGet Packages. Up another screen that shows you what is installed. So we have all of these packages, and remember that we had done individual user accounts when we created a project. So when you look at it, you'll see the .NET Core.identity.ui, right? So that's a package that we downloaded, and certain libraries to handle connections to our database. And then if the library you want isn't already installed, you can always go to browse, and they will list out all the libraries available to you on the NuGet platform. So here's jQuery. You can download jQuery references right here without manually going and getting the files. You have AutoMapper. You have quite a few of them. Some may mean something to you right now, some may not, and that's fine. Just note that it's important that you include pre-release when you're searching, because we're using .NET 3.1, which is brand new. And so some people may not have published very publicly the .NET Core 3.1 version of their package just yet. So by including pre-release, then we're making that release available to us for download and inclusion. Next, we have properties. And if we go into properties, you'll see launch settings.json, which opens up this file. We don't have to touch anything here, but this is basically just a file with some directives that when we're launching, this is what we're expected to do. So you can modify it if you know exactly what you're doing. If not, then you can leave it as is and change it on a case by case basis. All right. Next, we have our www root. Now, www root folder has our static files. And when I say static files, I mean any CSS file, any JavaScript file, or any, well, lib has the Bootstrap and jQuery. So it comes with those things already built in. It comes with Bootstrap file references by default. So if you were planning to use Bootstrap, then you don't have to go very far because it's already a part of the project template that we would have created. If we want any JavaScript files that we're going to be developing, we put it here. Site.css is basically just their CSS file that they gave us that we can modify if we want to add things that Bootstrap may not necessarily give to us. So all in all, anything that is a client-side static file, they gave us the framework as to where to put them in the CSS, and they're usually CSS and JS files. We wouldn't be making HTML files necessarily in a project like this. So it's really CSS and JavaScript files that would be created and placed in these folders, and all of those are in the www root folder. Next, we have areas. And as we go into the identity stuff, we'll explore what goes in here. But areas is basically like a segmentation of your application. So you'd have like an admin area versus an employee area versus a user management area. So by default, because we included the user authentication, we got identity as an area. And it's empty now, but when we get to that point, you'll see it fill up a bit more. Next, we have controllers. Now, I may not have spent much time explaining what the M, the V, and the C really mean in MVC, but they stand for models, views, and controllers. And so we have a folder for controllers, and you'd notice that we have a folder for models and we have a folder for views. Now, the controller, since it appears first in the list, I'll explain it first, pretty much dictates what the web application should do. So when somebody clicks on a page, when they click on a link rather, they are requesting content, they're requesting a page. So when they click on that link, that is a request which is sent to the controller. So a controller receives a request, and then when it gets the request, it says, okay, this person requested this link or this content based on the information that I'm getting. And then it will return the content as best as it can. If it can't, then you get like that 404 error. So the controller is literally pulling the strings based on what the user is requesting versus what the application has to offer said user. So let me put it in a little simpler term, or well, within the context of what is in the actual file. So in the controllers folder right now, we have one controller and it's called home controller. So that's a naming pattern, home controller. So whatever the name of the controller is, we have that name and then the word controller, and it should always be in camel case, just like that. And then our file, well, this one was generated for us, so we can just go through it and look at it. We see that we have public class home controller. So the same name of the file is the same name of the class that is there, and it is inheriting from a base class called controller, and that one is system provided. And I'll start with index. So index is usually the very first page that loads on any website. So when you go to a website, Amazon.com, Google.com, YouTube.com, the first page that comes up is usually called index, regardless of the extension, whether it's .php, .html, whatever it is, it's almost always called index. And so if we were to browse to our leave management and just go to the home, so we said leave management and just said /home, then the first thing it would do is try to find index. All right. So home/index is the content that we, the users, would be requesting. And so the controller is going to check if it has a function called index. If it does, then it says, what does index say I should do? Then it says return view. So the view is what the user sees. All right. So remember, we have M, we have V, and we have C. Model, view, controller. So the controller is saying, I got a request from a user, and so I'm going to do what I am commanded to do, or this is the content that that user should see, which is the view. Whatever the user sees is the view. So if I look in my views folder, then I'm going to see a folder with the corresponding name for my controller. So I have home controller, that's the name of my controller. I have a views folder called home. And so for every function that is defined inside of my controller, so at least index and privacy, if I look inside of this views folder for the home controller, then I should see some file with the same name. So I have an index file. Sorry, let me just get back there quickly. I have an index function, right? A function called index, and it's returning view. The expectation is that when it says return view, it's going to look inside of that folder with the corresponding name for some file with the same name as the function. So for privacy, you see a file called privacy. Arrow kind of does something different. It just returns a view with some content in it. And I soon get into that, why it's a little different. But at the end of the day, we're returning view, and we're returning view here. The code is identical, but then contextually it knows that it's returning the view that corresponds with the name privacy. So it looks in the folder and finds a file with a corresponding name. So since we started off with index, let's look at the index view. So if I double click the index view, you see that it's really just loading, and it's saying, okay, H1 tag welcome. So this is an HTML file, but notice the extension says cs.html, and this is a special extension because then it allows us to kind of inject C# code into our page as we may want to. All right, so here you can see that this does not look like HTML. This is not HTML at all. It's actually a little bit of like a C# kind of hybrid, C# HTML kind of hybrid page. All right, so if you're familiar with PHP, then that kind of coding is applicable in a CS HTML file. Now, the default error page is here, and it is returning a view, and it's a view somewhere, and it's returning some error view model. So notice that regardless of the name, let's not look at the name of this, but if you're familiar with C#, then this is really a class. This is how you declare a class, and we're returning a view with some class that is going to have some data. You notice it's saying request ID, and it is stating what the content of that variable should be. Essentially, this is content. So once you're going to be producing content that's not static, so static content is like this. I typed it and I left it. However, based on what I declare this class to be and pass into the view, then that can be contextual. I can say, if it's this type of error, I want this kind of message, etc., etc. Or maybe I want data to be displayed. And once data or dynamic content is to be displayed, then what we're using is the models. So we had the V and the C. We have the views and we have the controllers. Now we're looking at the M, which is models. And we have a models folder. And in this models folder, we have one model called error view model. And you notice that that is the same one that is being declared or initialized here with some content and being passed into some view that should correspond with the word error or name error. If we looked in the views and look in shared and then look in in the shared folder, we'll see that we have that error.cshtml view file there. All right. So when this serves up the error page, it is really going to serve up this view with some text error, and error occurred while doing your request. And then it gives you that same request ID. And notice it's quoting from the model.request ID. So note, in the controller, we had error view model, request ID. So once this view is rendered, it has whatever content we had put into error view model. It can access it, and then we can dynamically print that to our users using, well, the C# syntax. So see, we have an if statement, and that's what I meant by the CS HTML allows us to kind of inject some C# with our HTML. All right, so moving along, hopefully you have a better grasp of MVC. I know that was like a crash course, but don't worry, we have a whole course ahead of us and we'll get to understand everything as we go along. So we have the app settings.json. This is where connection string or strings are set up and how we want logging to be handled. And so this default connection, pretty much, you can change the name if you want, but it's there. And this is going to create a database on a server called LocalDB. So I did say that we're using SQL Express. We're actually using a smaller version of SQL Express, and that's called LocalDB, which kind of comes built into Visual Studio. Granted, we can access it in Visual Studio or we can use the Management Studio, but that's up to us. So there are certain settings outside of the database. There are certain settings that we can put here and access, and it's in a settings file. So if we need to change something, we just come here, change it, and move along. Our program.cs file, this is a standard file that comes with core applications, and it's really just like an initializer. So it's just creating the environment for the .NET Core application to start up and exist in. And then our startup.cs has more configurations for us. So .NET Core is very modular in nature. We can put in connectors, take them out, reference things here, don't reference them there. At the end of the day, this file, the startup.cs file, comes with a configuration initialization, and we configure, we set up different services that are needed. So for instance, we need to connect to the database that is defined by the default connection string, which we just looked at in the app settings. So we can change the connection string here, but then we have to make sure that we change the connection string. We can change it in the config file, but we have to make sure if we change it in the config file that we change it in the startup.cs file reference also. We can configure certain defaults about our identity. Identity, once again, is what we're using to handle authentication and authorization. We set up services for controllers with views and readers of pages. So once again, .NET Core is versatile. It can be used for desktop, web, or even a console application, mobile application. So you may not necessarily need all of these depending on the context. So when you set up the project, your startup.cs file is going to look very different based on what kind of project it is that you are creating. So a desktop application wouldn't need controllers and wouldn't need Razor pages. A web application does. All right. So we do that. We also have a configure function for the environment. So we do certain things based on the type of environment, and we're using certain routing and authentication functions, and we're setting up what the default pattern for browsing should look like. So there are a number of things that we can set up. We're not going to make any changes or be too intrusive in the changes in this video, and throughout the course, we made the changes on a case-by-case basis. So now that we've seen how the folder structure looks and we have a better understanding of what we're looking at, and I think I skipped over the data folder. So the data folder, I did skip over it. The data folder houses our DB context and our migration. So our DB context is a file where when we're setting up the database, we won't be going into SQL Server and creating the database the traditional way. We're going to be using a technique called code first, where we're actually just going to build classes that will model what our tables will look like. We have to add them to this file, and then we have to run what we call migrations, which will actually generate the database for us based on those models that we would have created, or those data classes. All right. So I'm not going to get into that in this. I just want you to understand what's in the data folder. But right now, what I want to do is actually run this application as it is so that we can see what our web application looks like out of the box with no modifications done. So we clicked IIS Express, that green arrow, and then it starts what you call a debugging process, where it checks if you have any syntax errors or anything in your code is going to prevent it from running. So it does all of those checks, And then at the end of those checks, it will launch a browser with your application. So this is Visual Studio in debug mode. All right, so they actually allow you to click through your files, but it's taking diagnostics and showing any activity based on your use of the application while it's in this mode. And here we see our application is loaded. So I can click around, I can click home. So remember I was saying that the index directory or the index view in the home controller is always going to be the default. You can change that, but it's always going to be the default. And so remember we saw that H1 tag and some other P tag. All right, and then if we click privacy, then it browses to home/privacy. See that? If I change that and I write index, then it's going to go right back to our index page. And then in Visual Studio, while we want to see how our application is running, what we can do is add what we call breakpoints. So let's say I'm experiencing some form of error and I'm not exactly sure why or where that error is. I can set a breakpoint, let's say here. So this breakpoint, you just click along this panel between the docking bar and the code lines. So the mouse will turn inverted when it's in this section, but then it will return to normal here. And when you click, you see that red dot and that line is highlighted in red, right? So I'm going to browse the index once again, and then what it's going to do is hit this function and then proceed to do what's in the function. But then it will pause on the breakpoint because that's where I want the application to pause. Or rather, let me do it on the privacy page. So I'm going to pause on returning the view for privacy. So I'm going to go back and then I'm going to say privacy. And then note, it loses focus on the browser and then it highlights the line where it is. So it's saying that you're about to do this process. At this point, I can choose to skip, meaning I can go line by line, which allows me to view all the variables and all the values being set, or I can just continue or press F5 to continue, and then the application will proceed as it should. All right. So that is essentially how we go about running our application. If I go to login, then I think I'm going to get an error because there are certain steps that I didn't get an error. Okay. There are certain steps we need to complete before we can actually do this. So if I click register, then I believe I'll get that error. And there we go. So it's saying that there was a database operation failure and we need to do some migrations before we can proceed. So that's an activity for later down. But for now, I just wanted you to understand how Visual Studio works and how our project is set up. So I can actually just close out of this browser window. And once you close the browser window, Visual Studio will exit debug mode and go back to the mode where it allows you to write code freely. So that's it for the tour of the folder structure of our .NET Core 3.1 application. And in the next video, we will start setting up the layout. So you saw the layout just now. It had that kind of bootstrap feeling to it already, but we're going to just go ahead and make some modifications at least to get started.